Yeah, so, there's a lot of news or a lot of headlines out there right now, especially from the right, about how white South Africans are having their farmland stolen. I just wanted to know what your historical perspective is on that.
Well, when I was growing up in South Africa, the Group Area Act, and that affected all the races, coloreds, the Indian, the blacks, South Africans. We all used to live together in certain areas in Durban, Pietermaritzburg. I'm talking more Natal, um, KwaZulu Natal.
Mm.
And then you would just have the government sending you a letter to say the Group Areas Act, and that whole area designated Cato Manor, Cato Ridge, people living a normal life, that those lands were taken away from you. Farmlands, Westville, they were taken away. Roosfontein, they a letter that said eminent domain, the land is now taken away at the and you had to move.
Mm.
You had to leave your farms. Uh, they bought your houses at a price that they gave uh, established,
Right.
and you had to go into townships, Chatsworth, Newlands, um, Amlazi, Kwamashu. We were all sent into townships,
Wow.
and the land was given to whites, and they made it into gorgeous areas
Mm.
that they are living in now. And now it's a multiracial because of the new South Africa, but it's really 90%, 70% of the land. It's proof that 70% of the land is owned by 7% of the people
Mm.
who are white.
Yeah.
So I have no clue what are they talking about, but most of the gorgeous farms, all of Stellenbosch, most of Stellenbosch, all the wineries are owned by white South Africans. It's a beautiful country, and we all love it. But this thing about them now, us taking the land, Mandela offered people the land. They had to stay in, and lots of people, their lives were like 20 years, 30 years, or 40 years in a township. They couldn't go back to farming. They
Mm.
had no idea. The children didn't have an idea about farming. So some of them took the money, which was not as substantial as what the land ever would be.
Yeah.
If you're looking 40 years of giving up your land, how much it's worth now. But please look up South Africa's Group Area Act, and you'll find out what a mess they made of that.
Hmm. Wow.
So I grew up in apartheid South Africa as a English-speaking white boy. I only became politically conscious when I was already 18 years of age, because prior to that, I had been subjected to and sucked in this incredible propaganda of victimization of the white people, where every piece of news, every message we were getting, every joke, the butt of every joke was the stupidity of the black man, the inability of the black man to look after himself, never mind the country, to be ignorant, uneducated, break everything he touched. The messaging was that all violence was black violence, that all crime was black crime, that you had to fear black people. And a huge amount of that fear was that if we let them into the political process, into the governance of the country, that they would do to us exactly what we had done to them for decades, which would be to turn around and oppress us, to murder us, to take our stuff, to move into our houses. It was a very popular story that the ANC, prior to the 94 election, when it was still an illegal organization and Nelson Mandela was still in jail, and the armed wing was exiled to Zambia and Mozambique, Umkhonto Wesizwe, was that they promised all of our domestic servants that those servants would be given the house they worked in when the ANC ruled. And these stories were told amongst the whites to bolster our resolve never to let these black people run our country. And it was only when I became conscious of that from 18 onwards that I realized not only was this a terrible lie that was actually oppressing us as well as the people that we as a white nation, white minority, were oppressing. but that actually what happened subsequently from 1994 onwards was far more of a reflection of the nature of black South Africans than any fears we as white South Africans had been fed and believed, right? And I see direct parallels with what's happening in Palestine and Israel. We've been fed this bullshit of Israel as victim, of the Zionist government as defending, this idea that the entire Arab world wanted to wipe them off the map, when in fact, prior to the Nakba, prior to Palestine being given to Israel by the colonial powers, primarily Britain, many Jews lived very happily and harmoniously alongside Muslims and Christians within that region. They weren't oppressed there. They became the oppressor through the Zionist ambition of a few Israelis. The white government for many, many years in South Africa needed the violence of Umkhonto weSizwe. They needed the odd bomb to go off. They needed terror attacks because it justified the further repression. And I've told stories about when I was in the South African Defence Force in 1987-88, 88-89. The things that were done by the intelligence service to undermine the ANC and other liberation struggles, and to pit black against black, to distract black people from action against the oppressive minority and the history of oppression. And it's time to step aside from what we've been told and look at the truth, look at the reality, look at the history, educate ourselves, and make a moral judgment based on our real values as a human.
Many white South Africans who fear Julius Malema. Some of them have said to me, if Malema gets to power or close to power, I will leave this country. Do you welcome their fear, or do you want to find ways to overcome their fear?
I don't welcome their fear. Stephen, they said that about Mandela, the most celebrated Mandela. You're talking about me. They said if Mandela, a prisoner, becomes the president, who will live in this country, and they left. I was in the Vaal River the other day, looking at some of the houses that whites abandoned in 1994 when Mandela became a president. They are not scared of Julius Malema. They are scared of an independent black man who's not controlled by any white person, who's not controlled by London. The only thing you can keep on referring to is what you interviewed me about it 12 years ago. Get something new, my brother.
No, I'm very...
Show a skill of a hard-working presenter who does his research. You can't falter me. Since I've made my mistakes on text when I was very young, when I was almost 27 years old, fixed that problem. Today, I'm a 42-year-old married man with children who has taken responsibility and built a solid party to be the third largest party without the support of white monopoly capital and the owners of the South African economy. You keep on referring to old and old things because you are now beginning to sound like a scratched CD.
You have every right to tell me you have changed.
Tell me of me now.
Why can't a black person come here? It's not the right question. It's more a question like a marriage between two people. It's an exclusive affair. Doesn't mean you're against anyone else.
You are preserving your culture on a land that belongs to South Africans.
The land here we bought, we paid for it.
From who?
Well, at that stage we bought it from the previous owner, which was the government.
I don't think an African can leave Africa, go to Europe and say that we just bought this land and no one is allowed to come in.
We feel part of this continent, and maybe people don't agree, but I don't have another home. Obviously, I know that I have European roots.
Yeah.
For 400 years, my people have been here.
Yeah.
I love Africa. I don't want to live any place else. When I've been overseas, this is the only place that I feel at home. These men are part of our history. No nation's history is only good, but also no nation's history is only bad.
Would you agree with me if I say that this man performed a lot of atrocities in the past?
Obviously, these are controversial figures, and I think that's why Orania is also a solution to a lot of the international conversation about monuments, because this is on private land, private funds, and it's our history.
I know it's your history, but at the end of the day, a lot of people were harmed in the process. You don't think if you are embracing this, you're definitely embracing apartheid?
Is it okay to celebrate Shaka Zulu, Zulu leader? Do you know who that is?
I know who Shaka Zulu is.
He killed a lot of people. Is it fine to celebrate him?
That's a question for South Africans.
That is a question. This is a question for Iranians.
He was more like the architect for apartheid. I mean, we can never forget our history. But I mean, I feel like this being here, it's more like a sword in the eyes of the people of South Africa.
I don't think so.
You don't think so?
I don't think so.
Do you believe that whatever you guys are practicing here is racism?
I do not believe that we are practicing racism. To tell you the truth, if the question is, are there racists in Iran? I can assure you there are. There are racists in every town in South Africa and every country in the world you'll find racists. That is a fact. The Iranian model is a model of cultural preservation. And that is not racist.
So if you check the coat of arms of South Africa, it said there is unity in diversity. What you are practicing in here is not unity in diversity.
I beg to differ. How can there be any diversity in South Africa if cultures are not allowed to be themselves? And what you're not going to get in Orania is people falling on their knees, continuously saying sorry for their history. A lot of people apologized on our behalf for everything.
How did white South Africans get so wealthy? South Africa is the most unequal society in the world. And it freaks me out how many South Africans complain about BEE, or they say 30 years of democracy, isn't that enough for you? In exactly that accent. And how little most South Africans know about economic apartheid. How far colonial and apartheid governments went to lift up white people and suppress people of color for hundreds of years. The simple truth is, black economic empowerment is nothing compared to white economic empowerment. Your parents may have worked hard, very hard, but the paler their skin, the more they benefited from extraordinary government economic aid. And here's when old people say, oh no, but what about this black person who's wealthy, or this black person who's made a lot of money? But here's the thing, right? Bad systems always hide behind miracle cases, the radical exceptions that make it out of a bad system even though it doesn't support them at all. They try to make it look like the exception, the miracle, is the average person in the system. And everybody who doesn't make it, well, that's their fault. It's not the system's fault. So here's the issue with white economic empowerment: how white people benefited from extraordinary government economic intervention. You know that speaking about apartheid is hard. So much of it happened off the record, people dispute it. So I'm going to make this super simple. All I'm going to do is tell you about a handful of apartheid policies that were enacted on the record, no doubt about it, that advantaged white people and oppressed black people. So let's start in 1910, when the Union of South Africa was formed. Literally, the country was invented for the first time, and government policies affected everybody in the country. The Second South African War had just ended. It was between the Brits and the Boers, and the Brits won. But they wanted to unite all white people together, especially Afrikaners, because they'd been fighting each other and killing each other for years. And so immediately, they made it that no people of color could vote. Instantly, unite the white people, only they can vote, only they can control the making of the new country. Then in 1913, the Land Act made it illegal, impossible for black people to own land outside of reserves. That meant 93% of all land in South Africa was only available to white people. Then, in the early 1920s, poor white Afrikaners protested that most of big industry was dominated by British companies, and those companies were hiring skilled black workers over them. In response, the government funded enormous public works programs, like building the Hartbeespoort Dam, and they only hired poor white workers. They literally made programs to make jobs for poor white, particularly Afrikaner workers. Also in 1925, the Wage Act made a minimum wage for white workers but not black workers, and the government offered incentives to companies applying for tenders. The more white workers you employ, the more likely you are to win work. Let's jump to 1948, when the National Party returns to power and formalizes apartheid for the very first time. And the first thing they do is direct massive funding to social programs and welfare grants for poor white people, and slashed funding for people of color across the board. In 1950, the Group Areas Act stopped black people from moving through South Africa freely. They had to get permission to go places, always on white people's terms, and this made it incredibly hard to find work. In the 1950s and 60s, the apartheid government fixed black people's pensions, which meant that as inflation increased, the value of those pensions got less. At the same time, white people's pensions increased dramatically. Black South Africans were forced into the Bantu Education Act in 1953, where they were literally only taught how to do basic unskilled labor. They were reduced to servitude. The Nats worked incredibly hard to promote white, specifically Afrikaner-owned business. You know why the Nats had African language radio stations through the SABC? To make money for white people off of black people. In the 60s, the apartheid government handed out millions of radios and ran the African language stations themselves. Obviously, they used it for propaganda to try and control the flow of information around apartheid, but they also gave ad space, reaching this massive new audience to white, especially Afrikaner-owned businesses at knockdown rates. And some of the biggest companies in South Africa today started that way. Afrikaner-owned, benefiting from ad space on African language radio stations that the apartheid government handed them. I could go on, you get the point. And you know what I said earlier about the average experience showing what the system actually does? Well, let's look at what the apartheid system did to South Africa. In 1996, the first ever truly national census was taken, where all South Africans were asked what the reality of their lives were like. Because of apartheid, the 1996 census found that 21% of black South Africans lived in informal housing. That's over 6 million people. And you know how many white South Africans lived in informal housing in 1996? 0.1%. More than 7 million black South Africans in 1996 had no access to piped water. 97% of white South Africans had access to piped water. Let's talk about refuse removal. 59% of black South Africans had no access to regular refuse removal in 1996, more than 18 million people. 92% of white South Africans had access. Electricity. 56% of black South Africans had no access to electricity in 1996 at all, more than 17 million people. 99.6% of all white South Africans had good access to electricity. That is the reality that economic apartheid created in this country. A few weeks ago, there was a news headline. It said, "South Africa not ready for a white president." And you know how sometimes you see a news headline and you think, what a waste. Like, why did you waste the ink and paper on that? Obviously, South Africa's not ready for a white president. Although it does make sense when you see who said that quote. It was the leader of the Freedom Front Plus. Sorry, Die Vryheidsfront Plus. This quote actually annoys me so much because it feels like it's implying that South Africans who aren't ready for a white president are somehow being unreasonable or should change or should think again. I mean, seriously, after centuries of abuse and oppression based on race by white people, and now what? They want trust. They want forgive and forget. That show got cancelled. Trust is earned, and I would say it's pretty damn reasonable to wait a little while longer to see if that trust is deserved. So, that's the issue with white economic empowerment. Thank you so much for watching this episode of The Issue with Dan Corder. We release one episode every single week on YouTube, and we also have a podcast, which you can find on all the streaming platforms, and you can find our socials in the video bio. Please like, subscribe, spread the word. See you soon.
I'm in the process of sponsoring a family that is fleeing South Africa due to the white genocide. I am not going to let a white group of people suffer and not help them because I've been bullied into not giving a shit. That ain't me. Wrong dude. Don't care. These people want to be Americans. They don't want to be South Africans anymore because that country was given over the minute that fucking cocksucking communist Mandela was let out of prison. They're going to live in my house, and I'm going to fucking feed them and take care of them.
Suffice to say that I got involved in the abuse of the minority white race in South Africa a couple of years ago, got heavily involved, ultimately ended up sponsoring a family of 4 and helped facilitate them from Africa. Obviously, it turned out bad. They did play me, and they admit, in fact, that was one of the things they said was they're bragging about how they played me like a sport game. I spent over $30,000 in that 11 months in money and fed and clothed them. So I might be stupid enough to have fallen for that because I thought with my heart instead of my head. You know what? They cost me a lot of money when they were here, suck and parasite and use people, and then when they're done, they just fucking, go on to the next fucking victim. When they talk to me, it's like, hey, we're a good family, we own a business, and we're hardworking people, and, when we get to America, the way we'll pay the rent will be we'll work for you guys, All right. If anything, we had to work 10 times as hard just to fucking take care of these people. I mean, in 11 months, I got my grass cut 3 times. One time ended up being in a huge argument. Everything fucking free. Lay around, watch TV, and watch fucking movies for 11 months and